I start the seventh meeting by a few comments on some of the homework exercises that we did. First, exercise 9.4.2. There you are asked to reconsider the experiment that we did with the alphas, betas, gammas, and so on, and what can we say on the prospect theory. Well, on the prospect theory, everything stays the same as it was before because it's all about gains. Well, maybe for some of you, a delta was a loss, but it doesn't change anything really in what I say now. So we are here essentially dealing with gains, and then prospect theory is the same as rank-dependent utility. So still, the experiment was measuring the utility function for gains, and it was measuring the weighting function for probability, the gain weighting function. So we know how to do that. And you can imagine we can do the same thing for losses. So also for losses, we can measure the utility function and then the loss weighting function. And then the question I already discussed before, the question, does it mean that we can handle everything? We can handle gains and losses, so we can handle everything. Can we entirely measure prospect theory using what we did in the experiment? And we discussed it before. The answer is, well, maybe you can pause the recording and think about it if you don't know, remember it from previous discussions. So I'll give you a moment to pause. Anyway, the answer is no, we do not measure the loss aversion parameter. Loss aversion is the exchange rate between gains and losses. Then you only have to consider gambles that have both gains and losses. The experiment was not doing that. So the experiment did not fully measure prospect theory. Well, we've seen that before. The next exercise I want to say something about comes from the extra exercises not in the book. Is the extra exercise 9.5.3. That person, you remember, is okay, but any euro lost will bring quite some suffering because something has to be given up, so that every euro lost feels 2.25 times more than any similar euro gained. Question, is this person loss averse? And in fact, the answer is a terminological issue, and I hadn't yet very clearly explained it to you. So in that sense, maybe you could not answer the exercise. And now I should now explain the terminology more precisely as I do it. Well, in the terminology that we use in this course, this person is not loss averse. This person, what is happening with this person, this kink at this where he is now, reference point status quo, that is real utility. And that is it is therefore part of the basic utility function. For this person, the basic utility function has a kink at 0. So here is again, for basic utility, I mean the true real value. And loss aversion I use only for those effects that result from framing, because people happen to take reference point and consider some things to be losses, and then sometimes many people are overweighting the loss outcome for no good reason. So that irrational framing effect, that I call loss aversion. And I distinguish basic utility as a real utility, and loss aversion is only that, well, maybe irrational framing effect. Now you can raise the question, how can we distinguish the two? For instance, from revealed preference, how can we distinguish using the economic revealed preference approach? Well, in that case, first in general, if you want to study reference dependence, you have to change the reference point and see what happens, because that's almost by definition reference dependence. What happens if the reference point changes? And also here, to see the distinction between basic utility and loss aversion, we have to change the reference point and see what happens. Imagine for this person, in terms of final wealth, we change nothing. So the person remains with the same amount of money and everything the same that can be done in life. But we make the person perceive the reference point differently, let's say 100 higher. And therefore we make the person perceive the changes with respect to the reference point all to become 100 lower. So in that sense, different reference point, but no difference in final wealth. Now, for the story, as I wrote here, the person, the kink of utility, does not move along with the reference point, but it stays where it is in terms of final wealth, because that's what is written here, what the person can do with money. So that's how we can see. If it were loss aversion, then, so this framing, then the kink would move with the reference point. Then in terms of the kink would remain at where the new reference point was. That was in terms of final wealth 100 higher than it was below. So then it's not really about what the person can do with money, but only how the person is perceiving money amount relative to the reference point. So then it would be loss aversion. So it is possible, maybe, that basic utility sometimes has kinks, that kinks need not always be loss aversion. But in general, if there is such a real kink, it would be very, very coincidental if it was exactly at what the person is perceiving as the reference point and often the status quo. And therefore, that's so coincidental that usually we don't believe it. So usually we find a kink at the reference point with people, and then usually assume that it's loss aversion. And in previous meetings, I've been more or less implicitly doing that automatically. But that's and we just assume a smooth basic utility because kinks are quite rare, and maybe only if you look with a microscope. For simplicity, we assume basic utility, and therefore the kink at the reference point we interpret it as loss aversion. That, well, irrational framing effect. So that's the terminology how we use loss. It's almost a bit circular almost. Loss aversion, almost by definition, is irrational. It's not a genuine, real aspect of utility in the terminology that we use. And some people in literature do it differently, so the confusion cannot be avoided. But this is how we do it.